A billionaire thought he knew the world, but watching his son crawl on a cafe floor to help a struggling waitress would change everything he believed about life, love, and courage. Richard Kane, a man known for his sharp business mind and immense wealth, rarely took time away from his work. His days were usually filled with high-stakes, meetings, phone calls, and decisions that affected millions of dollars. But today was different. Today, he had promised his 6-year-old son, Ethan, that he would spend a few hours together, just the two of them. It wasn't something Richard was used to. He wasn't the type to casually stroll through city streets or sit in cafes. Life for him was precise, structured, and always busy. But Ethan's small hand in his, tugging at him with excitement, made Richard smile. Something he did rarely in public. The cafe they entered was busy, with the low hum of conversations, clinking cups, and the rich smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Richard's eyes scanned the room automatically, a habit he couldn't shake. He noticed the worn wooden tables, the mismatched chairs, and the small potted plants on the windowsills. This wasn't the kind of place he usually visited. Everything about it seemed ordinary, simple, and in his mind, a little chaotic. But Ethan didn't care about appearances. He ran a few steps ahead, his small feet padding across the floor, and stopped near a table where a young waitress was cleaning up a spill. Leela. The waitress was bent low, wiping a sticky puddle from the floor. She had a tired but genuine smile, the kind that came from doing her best every single day despite challenges. Her uniform was simple, slightly wrinkled from the busy morning, and her hair was tied back hastily. She looked exhausted, yet she moved with a quiet determination that caught Ethan's attention immediately. The little boy crouched down next to her, curiosity sparkling in his eyes, and started imitating her movements. Richard's eyebrows furrowed. He had never seen a child act so freely in public, especially crawling on the floor with a stranger. "Ethan," he called, trying to sound firm, though his voice carried a hint of unease. But Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he giggled, a sound so pure and infectious that it made a few nearby patrons glance over and smile. The boy's laughter was different from the polished world Richard inhabited. It was raw, unguarded, completely free from worry or pretense. Lila glanced at Ethan and chuckled softly, not annoyed at all. There was something about the boy's innocence that made her pause and smile. "Careful there," she said gently, her voice warm. "You don't want to get all sticky." Ethan shook his head, his eyes wide, and continued his little game. Richard's heart thumped uncomfortably. Part of him wanted to pull Ethan away, to remind him of proper manners, of how children should behave in public. But another unfamiliar part of him watched, almost mesmerized by the natural connection forming between his son and this young woman. He settled into a chair nearby, crossing his legs and folding his hands, his usual posture of authority and control. From here he could observe without interfering. Ethan crawled, laughed, and pointed out tiny details on the floor, like a dropped sugar packet or a small crumb that fascinated him. Lila responded with patience, kneeling beside him when necessary and praising his efforts to help. The two of them seemed to exist in a little bubble of laughter and curiosity. Unaware of the world around them, Richard felt a strange mix of emotions. At first, he felt irritation. Why was his son crawling on the cafe floor with a stranger? It felt chaotic, unpredictable, and uncomfortable. But then he felt something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Admiration. Leela was kind, patient, and skilled at handling situations calmly under pressure. Ethan's fearless curiosity and joy were captivating. In that moment, Richard realized that no amount of money or power could create such genuine human connection. Ethan's hands were now sticky from the spill, and he giggled every time Leela gently wiped his fingers with a napkin. Richard found himself smiling despite his attempts to remain stern. He remembered how as a child he had been instructed to always sit up straight, to behave impeccably and to hide emotions that showed weakness. Yet here was Ethan, embodying joy and freedom without fear or expectation. Richard felt a pang of longing for a childhood he had never allowed himself to enjoy fully. Other customers in the cafe were starting to notice the interaction. Some watched quietly, smiling at the sight of a little boy helping a young waitress. A few whispered compliments to each other about the boy's innocence and the waitress's kindness. Richard, usually unconcerned with what others thought, suddenly felt exposed. He realized he was seeing a side of life he had always ignored. Simple. Messy, imperfect, but deeply meaningful. For a few moments, Richard allowed himself to forget the schedules, the meetings, the constant noise of business calls. He just watched. He watched the way Ethan's eyes lit up when he learned something new, how Leela's patience never wavered, and how small acts of kindness could create smiles that reached everyone around. It was a world he had always overlooked, a world he had never thought he needed. Ethan finally stood up, brushing off his tiny hands and giggling again. "I helped you, didn't I?" he asked, his voice full of pride. Lila nodded, smiling warmly. "Yes, you did. You're very brave and kind." Richard's chest tightened. He realized he had been holding his breath, unsure why he felt so deeply affected by this small scene. Here was his son, learning important lessons about helping others, while he himself had spent decades measuring life in dollars and deals. The rest of their visit passed in a mixture of quiet observation and small interactions. Richard ordered a coffee, trying to appear composed, while Ethan bounced around the cafe, still fascinated by the tiny details of the world. Lila continued to move gracefully among the tables, attending to customers, and occasionally glancing at Ethan with a smile that radiated genuine warmth as they prepared to leave. Richard felt an unfamiliar respect for Lila. She wasn't wealthy, she didn't have influence, and yet she commanded something far more powerful: the ability to connect, to teach, and to inspire. And Ethan, oblivious to the complexity of life, had already learned a lesson about empathy and courage that Richard knew would stay with him forever. Stepping outside, Richard held Ethan's hand tightly, his mind racing. He realized that these small moments scrawling on a cafe floor, laughing with a stranger, helping someone in need, were more valuable than any boardroom victory. For the first time in years, he felt a stirring of something he hadn't felt in a long time: humility. And as he glanced back at Lila through the cafe window, he couldn't help but wonder how much of life he had missed while chasing wealth and power. The day had started like any other quick outing to keep a promise, but it ended with a quiet, profound revelation. Richard knew that his relationship with Ethan, perhaps his understanding of the world itself, was beginning to shift in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. It was a small, ordinary cafe, but it had become the place where a little boy's laughter and a waitress's kindness began to change the life of a billionaire forever. Richard stepped outside for a few minutes to take a call, but his eyes kept drifting back to the cafe. Even from the sidewalk, he could see Ethan laughing with Leela, crawling around as if the entire floor were an adventure. Richard felt a strange tug at his heart, a mixture of confusion, pride, and irritation. He wasn't used to feeling emotions that he couldn't immediately control. While he was on the phone discussing business matters, his mind kept replaying the scene: Ethan's small hands wiping up a spill, Lila kneeling beside him, and the easy smiles they shared. Inside the cafe, Lila was finishing up her shift, juggling multiple tasks at once. She had been working there for years, but life outside the cafe was a constant struggle. She was a single mother, raising a young daughter, and the money she earned barely covered rent, bills, and groceries. Every day was a balancing act, and she often felt like she was barely keeping everything together. Yet, no matter how exhausted she felt, she carried herself with patience and kindness. Watching Ethan's curiosity and willingness to help brought a rare moment of joy into her hectic day. Ethan, fascinated by the tiny details around him, had now discovered a sugar packet that had fallen behind a chair. He crawled under the table, his little hands reaching for it, while Leela guided him carefully so he wouldn't hurt himself. He giggled as the packet slipped through his fingers a few times, but he didn't give up. Lila praised his determination, kneeling on the floor with him and showing him the right way to pick it up. Her voice was soft, encouraging, and full of warmth. For Ethan, it was a simple lesson in patience and helping others. But for Richard, who was watching quietly from a distance, it was something far more complex, a glimpse of a world he had almost forgotten existed. Richard felt uneasy. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. Why was his son crawling on the floor with a stranger? Wasn't this behavior improper? Undignified? Something that reflected poorly on him as a father? Yet, despite his initial irritation, he found himself captivated. There was a natural, effortless bond forming between Ethan and Lila, something genuine and rare. Richard had never experienced this kind of spontaneous connection. His life had always been about appearances, strategy, and results. Watching his son interact so freely with someone outside their world made him uncomfortable, but also deeply intrigued. Meanwhile, the cafe was a small world of its own. Other customers noticed the little boy helping the waitress. Some smiled quietly at the innocence of the scene, while others whispered compliments about Ethan's bravery and Lila's kindness. Lila remained humble, brushing off the attention, but Richard noticed the way she carried herself. She moved with confidence despite her struggles, a quiet strength that commanded respect without demanding it. Richard, who was accustomed to commanding respect through wealth and power, found himself feeling strangely small and unimportant in comparison. As the minutes passed, a minor accident occurred. A tray of drinks was knocked over by another customer, and a hot coffee spilled dangerously close to where Lila and Ethan were kneeling. Ethan's quick reaction saved Lila from being burned. He pulled the cup away just in time, his small hands moving instinctively. Lila's eyes widened in surprise, and then softened with gratitude. She patted Ethan on the head, whispering, "You're very brave, little one." Richard's breath caught. Part of him was overwhelmed with pride at his son's courage, but another part was anxious. He realized he had no control over this situation, and that realization made him uncomfortable. For the first time in a long time, he felt powerless in a small, yet significant way. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, laughed and continued helping Lila clean up the mess. He mimicked her movements, crawling and wiping the floor, giggling every time he succeeded at a small task. Richard watched in silence, torn between wanting to intervene and wanting to simply observe. His mind raced with thoughts he hadn't had in years. What did it mean to be kind? How did small actions like this matter? Could moments of bravery and empathy actually shape a child's future more than discipline and instruction ever could? He felt a stirring of emotion he couldn't name, a mix of admiration, confusion, and even envy for the freedom and innocence his son displayed so effortlessly. Lila, noticing Richard's gaze, smiled politely. She had seen wealthy customers before, men like him who often judged her silently. But this time, Richard's expression was different. There was tension, yes, but also something else, a quiet observation, a willingness to watch rather than command. Lila returned to her work, continuing to guide Ethan, but Richard couldn't tear his eyes away. Every movement, every small laugh, every shared glance between the boy and the waitress seemed meaningful in ways he hadn't anticipated. Richard began to notice the small details he usually overlooked. The way Lila's hair fell slightly over her eyes when she knelt. The way Ethan's tiny hands mimicked her careful movements. The laughter that seemed to fill the cafe in a way that no money or power could ever replicate. These moments were ordinary, yet they carried a weight and warmth that Richard had never experienced in his controlled, structured life. As the chaos of the spills settled, a quiet calm returned to the cafe. Ethan stood up, brushing his hands, and looked at Lila with pride. "I helped," he said. Lila nodded, smiling warmly. "Yes, you did. You're very kind and brave." Richard felt a strange, almost painful pride. Here was his son, learning lessons of courage, empathy, and patience in ways that he could never have taught. For the first time, Richard realized that life wasn't just about control, strategy, or appearances. There was a value in simple, unplanned moments of connection, lessons that money could never buy. Other customers continued to watch, some whispering about the boy's innocence, some smiling at the unexpected scene of kindness and bravery. Richard felt exposed in an unfamiliar way. He was used to being the one in control, observing situations from a distance and influencing them with power. But here he was just another observer, powerless yet fascinated. He realized that true respect and admiration weren't commanded, they were earned through genuine actions, humility, and courage. Ethan's energy was boundless. He darted from one small task to another, still eager to help, still curious about the world around him. Lila guided him, teaching him not just about cleaning or safety, but about care, patience, and understanding. Richard, watching this, felt a subtle shift inside him. He began to understand that his son's innocence and willingness to engage with the world was a gift, a perspective he had lost somewhere along the path of wealth and ambition. Time seemed to slow for Richard as he watched. Ethan and Lila, the bustling cafe, faded into the background, leaving only the small, powerful connection between a child and a young woman who faced life with resilience and kindness. He realized that these ordinary moments carried extraordinary lessons. Courage wasn't measured in wealth or status, kindness wasn't dictated by social standing, and connection couldn't be bought. It was created in small acts, in laughter, in empathy, and in the willingness to help others without expecting anything in return. As the afternoon wore on, Richard felt an unfamiliar sense of humility. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that his world of power and money was limited. It could not teach his son bravery, empathy, or patience. Those lessons came from experiences, from observing others, from allowing himself and his child to engage with the world in ways that felt real and human. Richard's thoughts kept returning to Lila, a woman who worked tirelessly, struggled daily, yet radiated strength and kindness, and to Ethan, whose laughter and curiosity reminded him of what life could be when approached with an open heart. By the time Richard returned to sit with Ethan, the spill was cleaned, and the cafe had returned to its usual rhythm. He noticed how Lila had handled everything with grace, even under pressure. Ethan climbed onto his chair, glowing with excitement, eager to tell his father every small detail of what had happened. Richard listened, and for the first time he found himself fully present, not analyzing, not judging, simply appreciating. He realized that life's lessons often came in unexpected forms, and sometimes all it took was a child's laughter and a stranger's kindness to show the way. Richard left the cafe that day changed, though he did not fully realize it yet. He had witnessed courage, kindness, and connection in a small, messy, and ordinary setting. And as he held Ethan's hand walking back to the car, he felt a quiet understanding beginning to grow, that the world outside his wealth and power had value beyond measure, and that his son's innocence and empathy were treasures far greater than any fortune he could leave behind. Richard couldn't stop thinking about the cafe, even after leaving. For days, the images of Ethan crawling on the floor, laughing and helping Lila, kept running through his mind. He realized something was shifting inside him. He had always believed that life was about control, wealth, and perfection. He had thought that being a father meant providing the best material life for his son, setting strict rules and teaching him discipline. But now, watching his son's interactions with Lila, he began to understand that there was a different kind of teaching, a teaching that couldn't be bought, measured, or forced. The following day, Richard returned to the cafe, not for himself, but because Ethan had begged him to see Lila again. Ethan's excitement was contagious. He ran ahead, waving and calling out, while Richard followed at a slower, more deliberate pace, trying to maintain his usual composure. He noticed the way other customers recognized Ethan and smiled warmly at him. Richard felt a mix of pride and a strange sense of humility. These simple connections in a busy cafe were teaching him more about life than any boardroom or meeting ever had. Lila was already working, moving swiftly between tables, taking orders, and cleaning up spills. She had noticed Ethan's arrival and smiled, giving him a small wave. "Hello, Ethan. Back to help again?" she asked, her voice warm and encouraging. Ethan nodded eagerly, crawling over to her as if he had a small mission to complete. Richard observed quietly from a corner table, still unsure how to react. On one hand, he was worried about his son's behavior in public. On the other hand, he couldn't deny the charm of the scene, the joy, the laughter, and the genuine human connection that filled the room. Ethan crouched down beside Lila, imitating her movements as she cleaned a small mess on the floor. Richard's initial irritation returned briefly. He couldn't believe his son was still crawling on the cafe floor like it was a playground. But as he watched more carefully, he realized that Ethan was learning something important: empathy, patience, and courage. Lila guided him with care, explaining in simple words how to be careful, how to help, and how to notice the little things that mattered. It was teaching in a way that no strict rule or expensive toy could ever achieve. Richard's curiosity grew. He wanted to understand Leela better. He noticed small details about her life and the way she moved and spoke. There was strength in her actions, a quiet determination that came from years of hard work and responsibility. He realized she wasn't just a waitress cleaning floors. She was someone who had faced life's challenges head-on, who had cared for her child, and who had a kindness that wasn't forced or fake. Watching her, Richard felt a sense of admiration, something he rarely experienced for anyone outside his world of wealth and business. Ethan, meanwhile, was fully engaged in helping Lila. He giggled every time he succeeded at picking up a fallen sugar packet or wiping a spill without making it worse. Lila praised him, teaching him that trying, even if imperfect, was important. "You're doing great, Ethan. See? Little steps matter," she said gently. Richard felt a twinge of guilt. He had spent years teaching his son rules, manners, and control. But he had rarely given him the chance to explore the world freely, to make mistakes, or to find joy in helping others. Seeing Ethan learn through laughter and play opened Richard's eyes to a different way of guiding his son. The cafe became more than just a place for coffee. It became a small classroom of life lessons. Richard watched as Ethan learned to notice the needs of others, to act with courage and kindness, and to take joy in helping someone without expecting praise or reward. Leela's actions were quiet but powerful. She didn't lecture. She didn't force behavior. She showed patience, understanding, and empathy, and Ethan absorbed it naturally. Richard began to see that life wasn't about rigid rules or perfection. It was about connection, care, and the small choices that built character. A small accident drew Richard's attention further. A child at a nearby table had knocked over a drink, and Lila quickly stepped in to protect both the child and the spilled drink from causing harm. Ethan instinctively offered his help, crawling over to hold a napkin and try to clean up. Richard's breath caught. His son was acting bravely and thoughtfully, guided not by fear of punishment, but by empathy and care. Richard realized that his son was learning lessons that money and authority could never teach. These were lessons of courage, humanity, and the importance of helping others in moments of need. Richard felt a deep sense of humility. He began to understand that his own wealth and influence could not create the kind of respect and admiration that Lila commanded naturally. Her strength and patience had earned Ethan's admiration and attention, not her money or her position. Richard's mind raced. He had spent his life striving for success, control, and recognition, yet here he was, learning from someone he would have once considered beneath his notice. He felt a quiet recognition that true power came not from wealth or control, but from empathy, kindness, and integrity. As Ethan and Lila continued their work, Richard noticed something even more profound. Lila wasn't just teaching his son practical skills. She was teaching him values. Ethan was learning about patience, resilience, and the importance of paying attention to small details. He was learning how to be brave in small ways, how to act kindly without expecting reward, how to enjoy the process of helping someone else. Richard realized that this kind of education could not be bought. It was earned through experience, observation, and genuine human connection. Richard's thoughts turned inward. He remembered his own childhood, filled with rules, expectations, and a constant push for achievement. He realized he had rarely experienced joy in small, ordinary moments. His lessons had always been about control, power, and appearances. Watching Ethan, he recognized the gap in his own upbringing. His son's laughter, curiosity, and bravery were teaching him things he had never learned: humility, empathy, and the beauty of simple human connection. Time passed quickly in the cafe. Richard remained quietly observing, allowing Ethan the freedom to explore, learn, and play. He noticed that other customers were watching as well, their smiles and quiet whispers acknowledging the small but meaningful interaction between child and waitress. Richard felt a sense of community he had rarely experienced in his life. He realized that despite his wealth, he had been isolated in a world of rules, contracts, and power dynamics. Here, in this ordinary cafe, he was witnessing something far more valuable than any business deal. Genuine human connection. Ethan finally stood up, brushing his hands, and looked at Lila with pride. "I helped," he said, his face glowing with excitement. Lila smiled and nodded. "Yes, you did. You're brave and kind, Ethan. Never forget that." Richard felt a pang of emotion he couldn't quite name. It was pride, yes, but it was also a sense of awe and recognition. His son was learning lessons about life and humanity in ways he had never imagined. And Richard was beginning to see the importance of allowing these experiences to shape him as a father and as a person. Realized that his presence in the cafe was no longer about control or supervision. It was about observation, learning, and understanding. He had spent so long believing that he needed to direct, instruct, and manage every aspect of life, but here he was learning to let go, to trust, and to appreciate the natural growth of his child. He understood that guiding a child wasn't about strict rules or constant oversight. It was about providing opportunities, allowing mistakes, encouraging empathy and courage. By the time they left the cafe, Richard's mind was filled with reflection. He had witnessed bravery, kindness, and human connection in a small, ordinary setting, and he knew it would stay with him. He understood that his son's innocence, curiosity, and empathy were treasures far more valuable than any wealth he could provide. Richard felt a quiet determination growing inside him, a determination to become a better father, not just by providing material comfort, but by fostering character, compassion, and courage in his son. As he held Ethan's hand, walking back to the car, Richard looked back at the cafe and at Leela, who was returning to her work. He realized that true strength, respect, and influence didn't come from money or power. They came from patience, empathy, courage, and kindness, the very lessons his son had been learning without even realizing it. Richard felt a sense of gratitude and humility. A recognition that life's most important lessons often came from ordinary people and small, unplanned moments. Richard knew, even then, that this experience was just the beginning. His understanding of the world, his son, and even himself was starting to change. He had witnessed the power of empathy, courage, and human connection firsthand, and he knew that he needed to carry these lessons forward. For the first time, he felt that his life and his relationship with Ethan could be richer, deeper, and more meaningful than he had ever imagined. The cafe was unusually busy that afternoon. Richard and Ethan had returned for another visit, not because Richard wanted to linger, but because Ethan had insisted, practically dragging his father along with excitement. Richard walked slowly behind his son, noting the chatter of the customers, the clatter of dishes, and the warm aroma of coffee and baked goods. As he observed the room, he realized that the cafe was more than just a place to eat. It was a small world where kindness, effort, and small acts of courage played out every day. Ethan, as usual, ran ahead, spotting a small spill near the counter. Without hesitation, he crouched down and began to help clean it, giggling as he worked. Leela, busy taking orders and serving drinks, noticed Ethan immediately and smiled. "Careful, Ethan," she said gently. "We don't want anyone slipping." Ethan looked up at her, nodded, and continued carefully, showing a determination that made Richard pause. The little boy's bravery and focus were remarkable, especially in such a crowded, sometimes chaotic environment. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen area. A tray full of drinks had toppled over, spilling hot coffee and water near the edge of the cafe floor. Customers jumped back, startled by the sudden noise. Lila acted instantly. She ducked under the counter to shield herself from the mess, while simultaneously directing another staff member to help clear the hazard. Ethan, without hesitation, crawled toward the spill, grabbing napkins and trying to help Lila. Richard's heart leapt. He had never seen his son react so quickly and without fear. The sight of Ethan, small but determined, assisting a stranger in a potentially dangerous situation, stirred something deep inside him. Richard moved instinctively, though differently than usual. He didn't step in with his commanding presence or insist on taking control. Instead, He followed Leela's lead, quietly helping to move chairs away from the spill and creating space for her and Ethan to work. He watched as Lila coordinated her staff with calm authority, her voice clear and firm, yet kind. Her actions were precise, yet filled with empathy for everyone in the cafe. Richard realized that this kind of leadership was not about wealth or power, it was about action, awareness, and concern for others. Ethan, fully absorbed in helping, accidentally dropped a napkin into the spill. Leela laughed softly, brushing it off. "It's okay, Ethan. Just try again," she said encouragingly. Her patience was remarkable. She didn't scold or get frustrated. Instead, she guided him gently, teaching him through example. Richard watched in awe. He had spent decades in boardrooms making decisions that affected millions, yet he had rarely experienced such immediate human lessons. Lila was showing courage, humility, and leadership in real time, and his son was absorbing every detail as the chaos settled. A few customers clapped quietly, acknowledging Lila and Ethan's efforts. Richard felt a swell of pride and humility at the same time. Pride for his son, who had acted bravely, without hesitation, and humility because he realized that wealth and influence could never replicate the lessons being learned in that small, ordinary moment. For the first time, he understood that real respect and admiration were earned through action, empathy and courage, not money or status. Lila continued to clean the floor, while Ethan crawled beside her, eager to help. Richard noticed the way she directed him gently, showing him the safest ways to work, teaching him responsibility without dampening his enthusiasm. Richard's mind wandered back to his own childhood, where mistakes were met with criticism and success was measured in perfection. He realized that his rigid upbringing had taught him discipline, yes, but it had never taught him empathy, courage, or humility. Watching Ethan learn these lessons from Lila in such a simple and natural way made Richard reflect deeply on the kind of father he wanted to be. The incident with the spilled drinks became a turning point in more ways than one. Richard saw that life could throw unexpected challenges at anyone, regardless of wealth, status, or age. How one responded calmly, bravely, and with concern for others was what truly mattered. Lila handled the situation perfectly, balancing her responsibilities, keeping everyone safe, and teaching Ethan important lessons along the way. Richard realized that he had underestimated the value of ordinary people and everyday challenges. There was a strength in kindness and patience that money and power could never buy. Ethan, meanwhile, was glowing with pride. "I helped, Daddy. I didn't let anyone get hurt," he exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. Richard felt his chest tighten. The boy was learning lessons about courage, responsibility, and kindness without even realizing it. Richard realized that allowing Ethan these small, unsupervised moments of learning was far more valuable than any lesson he could teach him through rules or lectures. He understood that parenting wasn't about control, it was about guidance, trust, and giving a child the space to grow. Richard also noticed how the customers reacted to the incident. They weren't impressed by wealth, authority, or appearance. They were impressed by genuine action, courage, and empathy. Lila and Ethan had created an impact simply by acting with care and responsibility. Richard felt humbled. His life had been spent chasing influence, but here, in a cafe full of strangers, he realized the true meaning of respect. Respect was earned through integrity, courage, and kindness. As the floor was finally cleaned and the cafe returned to normal, Lila crouched beside Ethan, smiling at him warmly. "See? Working together makes a big difference," she said. Ethan nodded, beaming. Richard felt an unusual emotion rising inside him: gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons Lila had unknowingly taught him, and for the opportunity to witness his son learning so naturally. He realized that life's most important lessons weren't learned in boardrooms or fancy schools, they were learned through action, experience, and human connection. Richard's perspective began to shift. He thought about his own life, the decisions he had made, and the constant pursuit of success. He understood now that while wealth could provide comfort, it could not teach courage, empathy, or humility. Those lessons came from real experiences, from observing others, and from being willing to step into messy, unpredictable situations. Watching Lila and Ethan, he began to understand that the world outside his controlled life had value beyond measure. The afternoon ended with Ethan holding Lila's hand as she guided him back to a clean table. Richard watched silently, reflecting on everything he had seen. He realized that his role as a father needed to change. It wasn't enough to provide for his son financially. He needed to provide guidance, experiences, and opportunities to grow. He needed to teach Ethan how to act with courage, empathy, and kindness in a world that was often unpredictable and challenging. As they left the cafe, Richard held Ethan's hand more gently than usual, appreciating the small warmth of the moment. He looked back at Leela, who was returning to her work, and felt a deep respect for her. She had taught his son lessons that he himself had only begun to understand. Richard realized that sometimes the most profound learning came from ordinary people, unexpected situations, and the courage to act when it mattered most. Walking back to his car, Richard felt a quiet sense of change. He knew that the incident at the cafe had left an imprint not just on Ethan, but on himself. The spilled drinks, the quick thinking, and the teamwork had become more than just a minor accident. It had become a lesson in bravery, empathy, and humility. He understood now that life's value wasn't in wealth or control, but in human connection and the small, meaningful moments that shaped character. Richard also realized something else. He had underestimated his son. Ethan was brave, kind, and capable of more than he had ever imagined. The boy's natural curiosity and empathy were guiding him toward lessons that Richard could barely articulate. He understood that his role was to nurture these qualities, not suppress them. Watching Ethan and Lila, Richard felt a mixture of pride, humility, and hope for the future. By the time they reached the car, Richard's mind was filled with reflection. He knew that his life and his relationship with his son was starting to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. The cafe, the spilled drinks, and the simple acts of courage and kindness had become a turning point. Richard realized that he had much to learn from ordinary people like Leela in moments like these. They had reminded him of what truly mattered: courage, empathy, and the small, meaningful ways we touch the lives of others. Richard buckled Ethan into his seat and glanced back at the cafe one last time. He felt gratitude, humility, and a quiet determination. He knew that this day, filled with unexpected challenges and small victories, had changed him. He understood that wealth and power could never replace the lessons he had learned by watching a brave little boy and a kind, strong woman work together to make a difference. And for the first time in a long time, felt ready to embrace a new way of living and parenting, one that valued heart, courage, and human connection above all else. Richard and Ethan stepped out of the cafe, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt a quiet sense of peace. The events of the day, the laughter, the spilled drinks, and the small acts of courage had left an impression on him that he could not ignore. He glanced at Ethan, who was still buzzing with excitement, recounting every detail to his father in rapid, animated speech. Richard smiled, listening patiently, realizing that the boy's joy was contagious. Ethan's perspective on life was fresh and innocent, full of curiosity and wonder, and Richard knew that he wanted to protect and nurture that outlook rather than restrict it. As they walked down the street toward the car, Richard thought about Lila. She had taught his son invaluable lessons, not through words, but through her actions. Her patience, bravery, and kindness had left a mark on both Ethan and himself. Richard had never considered the power of a person's character to influence and shape lives. For years, he had relied on wealth, authority, and rules to guide people, never realizing that true influence came from empathy, integrity, and courage. He began to understand that his own growth as a father and as a person depended on recognizing and learning from these qualities in others. In the car, Ethan continued to chatter about the day, his eyes bright and his smile wide. "Daddy, I helped her. I didn't let anyone get hurt," he exclaimed. Richard reached over and ruffled his son's hair gently. "I saw, Ethan. You were very brave," he said, feeling warmth spread through him. It was a proud moment, not because of achievement or recognition, but because he could see that his son's heart and courage were developing naturally. He realized that allowing Ethan to experience the world firsthand, to face small challenges, and to engage with others had given him lessons that no formal instruction could provide. Richard's thoughts turned inward as he drove. He considered his own life, the relentless pursuit of wealth, status, and control, and how it had shaped him. He recognized that while he had achieved great success in his career, he had missed out on the simple, meaningful connections that gave life its depth. Watching Ethan interact with Lila had opened his eyes to the value of empathy, humility, and human connection. He understood that these qualities were far more important than any material possession or accolade, and he felt a quiet resolve to change the way he approached life. Over the following days, Richard found himself reflecting repeatedly on the events at the cafe. He thought about Lila's resilience and her ability to manage challenges with grace. He thought about Ethan's courage and his willingness to step in and help without hesitation. Richard realized that these ordinary moments were extraordinary in their impact. They had taught him more about life, humanity, and fatherhood than years of business meetings or strategic planning ever could. He understood that his son was learning essential life skills through experience, observation, and guidance from people outside their privileged world. Richard decided to take small steps to integrate these lessons into his life. He began spending more quality time with Ethan, allowing him to explore, play, and engage with the world without strict supervision. He encouraged Ethan to interact with people from different walks of life, to notice their struggles, and to offer help when possible. Richard found that by doing so, he was not only nurturing his son's growth, but also learning himself about patience, humility, and the importance of genuine human connection. He also reached out to Lila. Initially unsure how to approach her, he wanted to express his gratitude, not in the form of charity or patronage, but in recognition of her strength, patience, and positive influence on his son. When he finally spoke to her, he did so with sincerity and humility. "Thank you for teaching my son today. I've learned a lot watching both of you," he said. Lila, cautious at first, smiled softly. She could sense his genuine respect and warmth, and she recognized that his words were heartfelt. It was a simple acknowledgement, yet it carried more meaning than any gift or financial reward could convey. Richard noticed a subtle change within himself. He felt less need to control every situation, to dictate outcomes, or to manage appearances. He realized that life was richer when he allowed others to act, to teach, and to share experiences naturally. The lessons from the cafe had taught him about trust, patience, and humility. He understood that his wealth and power were tools, not measures of his worth or his ability to influence lives meaningfully. True impact came from actions rooted in kindness, courage, and integrity. As weeks passed, Richard began to integrate these insights into his relationship with Ethan. He observed his son's natural curiosity, encouraging him to ask questions, explore, and engage with the world. He celebrated Ethan's small victories, whether it was helping someone, learning a new skill, or showing kindness. Richard realized that these moments, however small, were shaping Ethan's character far more effectively than any structured lesson could. The boy's laughter, bravery, and empathy became guiding lights for Richard, teaching him how to be a better father, a better observer, and a more compassionate human being. One day, while sitting together in a park, Ethan turned to his father and said, "Daddy, I like helping people. It makes me happy." Richard felt a lump in his throat. The words were simple, but their meaning was profound. He realized that happiness did not come from wealth, power, or control. It came from connection, empathy, and meaningful action. His son had already grasped a lesson that he himself had spent decades trying to learn. Richard silently vowed to honor that wisdom, to encourage it, to nurture it in every way he could. Richard also began to see the world differently. Ordinary people who had previously seemed insignificant or invisible in his busy life now appeared with new importance. He noticed their strength, resilience, and capacity for kindness. He began to understand that influence and respect were not given. They were earned through integrity, courage, and empathy. This realization reshaped his interactions, not just with Ethan or Lila, but with colleagues, friends, and even strangers. He became more attentive, more patient, and more willing to engage meaningfully. Rather than superficially, the lessons from Leela and the cafe extended beyond parenting. Richard started to approach his work with a renewed perspective. He understood that leadership wasn't just about decisions, profits, or authority, it was about empathy, guidance, and understanding the human element behind every action. He began mentoring employees differently, listening more, appreciating their efforts, and valuing their perspectives. The transformation was subtle, but profound. Rooted in the simple truth he had learned watching a child and a waitress work together, courage, kindness, and patience matter more than control or appearances. Ethan continued to grow under this new approach. His confidence and empathy blossomed, and he remained curious, brave, and kind. Richard noticed the boy's willingness to engage with people from all walks of life, to help others without hesitation, and to value character over appearance. The lessons learned in that small cafe, through a spilled drink and a simple act of crawling to help, had become foundational to Ethan's growth. Richard felt immense pride, not because of achievement, but because of the heart and courage his son was developing. Looking back, Richard realized that the cafe incident had been a turning point not just for his son, but for himself. The laughter, the spills, the courage, the kindness had taught him invaluable lessons about life, humanity, and fatherhood. He understood that his wealth and power could never replace these lessons. True growth came from experience, empathy, and meaningful connection. Richard had learned to value ordinary moments, recognize extraordinary qualities in everyday people, and appreciate the depth of human relationships in the quiet moments that followed. Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude. He was grateful for Lila, who had unknowingly taught both him and his son, for Ethan, whose innocence and courage reminded him of what truly mattered, and for the small, ordinary events that revealed the extraordinary in life. He realized that the world was full of lessons waiting to be discovered, and that humility, empathy, and kindness were the keys to understanding them. Richard knew that life would never be the same. His approach to parenting, his perspective on wealth and success, and his understanding of human connection had all shifted. He had learned that the greatest gifts he could give his son were not material, but experiential, opportunities to act with courage, to show kindness, and to connect meaningfully with others. These lessons would shape Ethan's future, just as they had reshaped his own. As they drove home that evening, Ethan chatting happily in the back seat, Richard felt a quiet joy he had never experienced before. He realized that life's most meaningful moments often came unexpectedly, in ordinary places and through ordinary people. The spilled drinks, the laughter, and the courage displayed that day had changed him forever. Richard understood that the true measure of success wasn't wealth or power, it was the ability to grow, connect, and inspire through empathy, kindness, and courage. Richard held Ethan's hand as they entered the house, feeling a profound connection and a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the lessons from that day, and from Leela's quiet guidance, would remain with him forever. He had learned to value courage over control, empathy over authority, and connection over wealth. And as he watched his son run ahead, exploring the world with unguarded joy, Richard understood that this was the true meaning of life: to learn, to grow, and to embrace the extraordinary found within ordinary moments.